Your father bought his first house at 26. One income, no degree required. A single paycheck from a factory floor covered a mortgage, 2 kids, and a boat parked in the driveway by summer. You did everything right. You worked harder than he did. You got the degree he never had. And somehow, you're 40-something, maybe 50, still calculating whether you can retire or whether you'll be working until the day they carry you out. Nobody told you the game changed. Nobody told you the rules your parents lived by simply stopped applying somewhere around the time you started playing. This isn't about blame. It's not about politics either. Not really. It's about math. Cold, quiet math that's been rewriting your future while you weren't looking. Tonight, I want to sit with you and go through it. Not to scare you, but to finally show you what actually happened to the middle class. And more importantly, what you can still do about it. Because there's still time, but only if you understand the truth first. Let's start with a number. Just one number, and I want you to sit with it before we go anywhere else. In 1980, the median home in America cost about 2.5 times the median household income. 2.5 years of work, roughly, to own the roof over your head. Today, that same ratio has climbed past 7 times income in most major markets. In some cities, it's closer to 10. Read that again. Not 2.5 years, 7. 10. Your parents weren't smarter than you. They weren't more disciplined. They didn't work harder. And I say that knowing some of you are shaking your head right now, remembering your father's hands, his early mornings, his exhaustion at the dinner table. I'm not taking that away from him. But he was playing a different game. A game where a single income could carry a family. Where a starter home was actually starter-sized and actually affordable. Where a pension waited for him at the end, quietly accumulating, without him having to think about it, without him having to become an amateur fund manager just to survive retirement. You inherited none of that. You inherited the myth of it. The story that if you go to college, get a stable job, save what you can, buy a house, and stay the course, you'll end up exactly where he ended up. But the math changed underneath the story, and nobody rewrote the story to match. Here's what I mean. Wages adjusted for real inflation. Not the sanitized government number, but what things actually cost you at the grocery store, at the pharmacy, at the pump. Wages have crawled forward at a pace that would embarrass a snail. Meanwhile, the cost of the things that actually build wealth, real estate, education, healthcare, have sprinted so far ahead that the gap isn't a gap anymore. It's a canyon. Think about what a college degree cost your father, if he even needed one. Now think about what it costs your kids. We're not talking about a modest increase adjusted for inflation. We're talking about a debt burden that follows a 22-year-old around for the next 20 years of their working life, before they've even had the chance to make their first real financial mistake. And here's the part that stings the most if you let yourself feel it. You didn't fail. You did what you were told. You showed up. You paid your dues. You didn't gamble on some risky scheme. You played it safe, exactly the way your father told you to. And playing it safe today doesn't get you where playing it safe got him. That's not a coincidence. That's not bad luck following you around your whole life. That's the result of decades of decisions made far above your pay grade. Decisions about currency, about debt, about how an economy gets structured. Decisions you were never in the room for, but that you've been paying the price of every single month since your first paycheck. I need you to hear this next part clearly, because it's the difference between spending the rest of your life angry at a system you can't control and spending the rest of your life building something that system can't touch. The old rules are not coming back. I want to say that gently, but firmly, because too many people your age are still waiting for the economy to return to something it will never return to. They're waiting for housing to become affordable again the way it was in 1985. They're waiting for a single income to be enough again. They're waiting for the system to apologize and hand back what it quietly took. It won't. Not because the system is cruel, though at times it certainly feels that way, but because systems don't apologize. They don't have a conscience. They respond to incentives, and the incentives changed a long time ago, in rooms you and I were never invited into. So the question isn't whether the game is fair. It isn't. The question is whether you're still trying to win a game that no longer exists, using rules that expired before you even knew they had. Because here's what I've come to believe, after watching this play out in my own life, and in the lives of people I've sat across from at kitchen tables for years. The people who are quietly doing well right now. Not flashy, not loud about it, just steady, calm, actually building something. They're not the ones who worked the hardest. They're the ones who understood the game had changed and adjusted before it cost them everything. That adjustment starts with something uncomfortable. It starts with letting go of the story you were told, even the parts of it that came from people who loved you and meant well. Your parents gave you their playbook because it was the only one they had. It's not their fault it expired. But it's your responsibility now to write a new one. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Because understanding what happened is only step one. Step two is understanding exactly how it's still happening to you right now, in ways you probably haven't noticed. There are three of them. Three quiet, invisible costs eating away at your paycheck every single month, and almost nobody is talking about them out loud. Let's talk about them, one by one, slowly, because they matter. The first one is the easiest to see, once someone points it out to you, and yet almost nobody adds it up correctly. It's inflation, not the number they announce on the news, rounded and smoothed and calculated in a way that somehow never quite matches your grocery receipt. I'm talking about what it actually costs to live your life, year after year, while your paycheck moves at a fraction of that speed. Think about your grocery bill 10 years ago. 15. Now think about what the same cart costs you today. Same brands, same quantities, sometimes even smaller packaging quietly sold at the same price. A trick so common now, it has its own name. You feel it every single week, and yet when you look at your raise this year, it barely covers the difference. That gap between what things cost and what you earn, that's not an accident of the economy. That's a tax. Nobody voted on it. Nobody sent you a bill with a government seal on it. But it's collected from you anyway. Every time you swipe your card, every time you fill your tank, every time you pay a bill that somehow crept up again this year. Here's the part that makes people the most uncomfortable. Inflation isn't just a side effect of the economy. It's often a tool. When a government owes enormous amounts of debt, one of the quietest ways to make that debt smaller in real terms is to let the currency lose value over time. Your savings shrink in what they can buy. The government's debt effectively shrinks in what it has to repay. You didn't get a vote on that trade, but you're the one paying for it, dollar by dollar, out of every paycheck. The second invisible tax is one you've probably done to yourself, and I say that with compassion, not judgment, because I've done it too. It's called lifestyle creep, and it is one of the most patient, most forgiving-looking thieves in your financial life. Here's how it works. You get a raise. You feel proud of it. You earned it. And almost without deciding to, your life expands to match it. The car gets a little nicer. The dinners out get a little more frequent. The vacation gets a little further, a little longer. None of these decisions feel reckless in the moment. Each one, on its own, feels earned, deserved, reasonable. But add them up over 20 years, and you'll find something strange. Your income has grown significantly. Your net worth has barely moved. Every dollar that could have compounded quietly into freedom got spent instead on comfort that disappeared the moment you consumed it. I'm not telling you to live like a monk. That's not what this is about. And anyone who tells you to give up every small joy in the name of some future you might not even live to see is selling you a different kind of lie. But I am telling you this, the space between your income and your spending, that space is the only place wealth can actually grow. And lifestyle creep quietly closes that space, year after year, without you ever making one single dramatic decision to blow your money. It happens in small, forgivable, invisible steps. The third invisible tax is the one almost nobody talks about because it sounds too abstract to matter, right up until it changes everything. It's currency devaluation. The slow, structural erosion of what a dollar is actually worth. Over time, independent of prices at the store, a dollar saved in 1980 doesn't buy anywhere near what it used to buy today. That's not because you spent it poorly. It's because the dollar itself was quietly diluted, year after year, decade after decade, through decisions made in rooms far above your understanding or your consent. This is why the old advice, just save your money, put it in the bank, let it sit safely, doesn't work the way it used to. Money sitting still in a low-interest account isn't safe. It's slowly losing its purchasing power while you sleep, while you work, while you trust that discipline alone will be enough to protect you. None of this is meant to make you feel powerless. I want the opposite for you. I want you to understand exactly what's been quietly taken so you can stop being surprised by it and start building around it instead. Because here's the truth. Underneath all three of these invisible taxes, they only work on people who don't see them. The moment you understand inflation, lifestyle creep, and currency devaluation for what they actually are, you stop being their victim. You start making decisions with your eyes open instead of decisions shaped by forces you never noticed pulling at you. This is exactly where the gap begins between the people who feel like they're always falling behind, no matter how hard they work, and the people who feel like they're finally, quietly, getting somewhere. And that gap almost never comes down to how much money someone makes. It comes down to one decision. One single financial decision that the wealthy make differently than everyone else. A decision so simple it sounds almost too obvious to matter. And yet it's the one thing separating people who build real freedom from people who spend their whole lives one paycheck away from panic. That's exactly where we're going next. And it might change how you see every dollar you touch. Let me tell you what that one decision is, and I promise you, it's simpler than you expect and harder to actually live by than you'd think. The wealthy ask a different question before they spend money. That's it. That's the whole secret, stripped of all the mystery people try to wrap around it. Before a dollar leaves their hands, they ask, does this put money in my pocket, or does it take money out of my pocket, month after month, for as long as I own it? That's the entire divide. Assets versus liabilities. Not the textbook definition, but the real one. The one that decides whether you're building freedom or quietly funding someone else's. An asset puts money in your pocket without you trading your time for it. A liability takes money out, usually while pretending to be a reward for your hard work. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The house you live in, the one your father called the smartest purchase you'd ever make. For most people, that's a liability. Not an insult to your home, not a suggestion to sell it and rent forever. Just an honest look at the math. It doesn't generate income. It costs you every month in maintenance, taxes, interest, whether or not the value on paper is climbing. Compare that to a rental property that generates income every month after expenses. Compare that to a small business that runs even when you're not physically present. Compare that to dividend-paying investments that deposit money into your account, whether you worked that day or not. The middle class was taught to accumulate liabilities and call them accomplishments. A bigger house, a newer car, a more impressive title that comes with a longer commute and a more demanding calendar. Every one of those things costs money to maintain, and none of those things pays you back while you sleep. The wealthy were taught something different, whether by family, by mentors, or simply by trial and expensive error. They were taught to accumulate assets first, and let the liabilities follow only once the assets could comfortably pay for them. In practice, that means before buying the nicer car, you ask whether an asset already covers it without touching your main paycheck. Before upgrading the house, you ask whether your investments have grown enough to absorb that cost. It's not about denying yourself. It's about sequencing. Assets first, liabilities funded by assets, not by willpower and hope. I know what some of you are thinking. That sounds nice, but I don't have extra money lying around for assets. I'm 40, 50 years old, still living paycheck to paycheck some months. I hear you. This isn't about how much money you have right now. It's about the direction of every decision from this point forward. Because here's what nobody tells you about wealth. It's rarely built from one enormous decision. It's built from 1,000 small ones, repeated in the same direction, over years that feel slow while you're living them, and look obvious in hindsight once you're standing on the other side of them. The families who quietly build generational wealth aren't usually the ones who made one brilliant bet. They're the ones who consistently chose the asset over the liability, even when the liability looked more exciting. And this is where good debt and bad debt come into the conversation, because debt itself isn't the enemy people make it out to be. Debt used to acquire an asset that pays you. That's a tool. Debt used to acquire a liability that costs you. That's a trap, dressed up in a monthly payment small enough to feel harmless. A loan on a rental property that generates more in rent than the loan costs. That's good debt, working for you while you sleep. A loan on a car that loses value the moment you drive it off the lot. That's bad debt, working against you every day you carry it. The wealthy aren't debt-free, most of them. They're debt strategic. They understand which debt builds and which debt drains, and they structure their lives accordingly, often quietly, without ever announcing it to anyone. I want you to sit with something for a moment. Think about your own financial life right now, honestly, without judgment. How much of what you own generates income for you? And how much of what you own simply costs you money every month, in exchange for comfort or status or the appearance of having made it? You don't have to answer out loud, but I think you already know the answer. And I think that answer explains more about your financial situation right now than any single mistake you've ever made. This single distinction asset versus liability, and the discipline to sequence your life around it, is the one financial decision that quietly separates people who feel stuck from people who feel free, no matter what their paycheck says. But understanding this is only the beginning, because there's a bigger question underneath all of it. Why does the system make this so hard to see in the first place? Why were you never taught this in school, in a country that claims to value financial literacy? That's not an accident either. And what we're about to talk about next might be the most uncomfortable truth in this entire video. Why weren't you taught this in school? Think about that honestly, because it's not a small question. You spent 12, 16, sometimes 20 years in classrooms. You learned the area of a triangle. You learned the dates of wars fought before your grandparents were born. And somehow, not once did anyone explain the difference between an asset and a liability, or how compound interest actually works, or how taxes reward certain decisions and punish others. That's not an oversight. This isn't about conspiracy theories or shadowy figures in a smoke-filled room. It's simpler, and honestly more uncomfortable than that. The system that educates you was built to produce good employees. Reliable, punctual, skilled enough to be useful, but not necessarily equipped to understand money well enough to stop needing a paycheck. Think about the incentive structure, an economy that runs on people showing up to work every day, borrowing to buy homes and cars, spending steadily, and retiring dependent on a system that manages their money for them. That economy runs smoothly. An economy full of people who understood how to build assets, minimize taxes legally, and become financially independent early. That would look very different, and a lot of institutions built around your dependency would have less power. I'm not telling you this to make you angry at your teachers. Most of them didn't know this material either. They went through the exact same system you did. I'm telling you this because once you understand the incentive, you understand why you've had to learn everything important about money the hard way, usually after a few expensive mistakes along the way. Here's where it gets even more layered. The tax code in this country isn't actually designed to punish the wealthy. Most people believe that, and it couldn't be further from the truth. The tax code is filled, page after page, with legal incentives for specific behaviors. Behaviors like investing in real estate, starting businesses, funding retirement accounts in specific ways, and reinvesting profits instead of simply spending them. The wealthy aren't breaking rules to pay less in taxes. They're following rules that were written, quite deliberately, to reward the exact behaviors that build long-term wealth. The tragedy isn't that these rules are secret. Most of them are published, public, available to anyone with the patience to read them. The tragedy is that almost nobody in the middle class was ever taught to look. Let me give you one concrete example. A W-2 employee, someone who works for a paycheck, taxes withheld automatically before the money reaches their hands, pays taxes on nearly the full amount they earn, with very few legal ways to reduce that burden. A business owner, or someone who owns income-producing real estate, can legally deduct expenses, depreciate assets, and structure income in ways that dramatically lower what they owe, all within the law. This isn't a loophole in the sense of some clever trick discovered by accident. It's a deliberate incentive built into the system, rewarding the behavior of building something that produces income, rather than simply trading hours for dollars. I want to be honest with you about something. This isn't easy to hear if you've spent 30 years as a loyal employee, doing everything right, following every rule you were given. It can feel, in this moment, like you were quietly left out of information that mattered. And in a very real sense, you were. Not through malice, necessarily, but through a system that simply wasn't built to hand you this knowledge freely. But here's what I need you to understand, and I need you to let this settle in. It's not too late. The rules that apply to a business owner at 30 apply just as much to one who starts at 50. Tax incentives for real estate don't check your age before they apply to you. Compound growth doesn't care how long you waited, only that you start and stay consistent once you do. The legal loophole, if we can call it that, isn't a secret code whispered between the wealthy at exclusive dinners. It's simply this: stop being only an employee and start becoming, in some capacity, an owner. An owner of a business, however small. An owner of income-producing property, however modest. An owner of assets that work on your behalf, even while you sleep, even while you're at your day job, even while you're watching this video right now. You don't have to quit your job tomorrow. Most people who build real wealth later in life didn't. They kept their income steady with one hand and built ownership quietly with the other, until eventually the ownership hand grew strong enough to stand on its own. The system wasn't built to stop you from doing this. It was simply built in a way that requires you to seek this knowledge out yourself, because it will never be handed to you by the same institutions that benefit from you not knowing it. And that brings us to something practical, something you can act on starting with the very next dollar that comes into your hands. What do people at the very top actually do differently with their first meaningful chunk of money? It's not what you've been taught. And once you hear it, you'll understand exactly why the gap keeps widening. Let me tell you about two men before we go any further. I'll call them Tom and Richard. Though those aren't their real names, the details don't matter much, because you already know men exactly like them. Maybe you grew up next door to one of them. Maybe, if you're honest with yourself tonight, you were one of them for a good stretch of your life. Tom and Richard started at the same company, the same year, in the same entry-level position. Same salary, almost to the dollar. Same handshake, same nervous first day, same parking spot in the same overflow lot because neither of them had seniority yet. 15 years later, Tom was still driving to that same parking lot, a little more tired, a little more anxious about the mortgage, still hoping the next promotion would finally make things feel easier. Richard wasn't in that lot anymore. He still had a job, still went to work most days, but somewhere along the way, work had quietly stopped being the only thing keeping his lights on. What happened in those 15 years wasn't talent. Richard wasn't smarter than Tom. If anything, Tom was sharper in meetings, quicker with numbers, the one people went to when something needed fixing. What happened wasn't luck either, not in any meaningful sense. Neither of them inherited anything. Neither of them married into money. Neither of them got some rare, lightning strike opportunity the other one missed. What happened was smaller than that, and far less dramatic, and that's exactly why it's so easy to miss. Every year, at review time, both men got a raise. And every year, Tom's life quietly expanded to absorb his entire raise, and usually a little more. Richard's life didn't. Richard kept living, roughly, like the man who'd started in that overflow lot 15 years earlier, even as his income slowly climbed above it. The difference between them, compounding year after year, wasn't an event. It was a gap, a small, steady space between what came in and what went out, that Richard protected, almost stubbornly, while Tom, without ever deciding to, let that space close a little more every single year. I want you to notice something about this story, because it's easy to hear it and think it's about frugality, about being cheap, about deprivation. It isn't. Richard wasn't unhappy. He took his family on vacations. He had a life he enjoyed. The difference wasn't that he suffered, and Tom didn't. The difference was that Richard understood something early that Tom never quite grasped, that the space between income and spending isn't leftover money. It's raw material. It's the only substance freedom is ever actually built from. This is the part that people your age, 40 and beyond, feel most acutely, because you've lived long enough now to see exactly how this plays out. You've watched friends retire comfortable, while others your same age are quietly terrified of what happens if their health gives out before their savings do. You've seen it up close, in your own family sometimes, in ways that are hard to talk about honestly, because nobody wants to admit that two people who worked equally hard ended up in completely different places. Here's what I need you to take from Tom and Richard's story, because it's not really about them. It's about a decision available to you tonight, whatever your income happens to be right now. That gap, the space between what you earn and what you spend, isn't fixed. It's not something that only exists for people who make more money than you do. It exists at every income level, waiting to be protected or waiting to be quietly spent away. One reasonable purchase at a time. And once you understand that the gap is the actual asset, not the income, not the job title, not the size of the raise, everything else we've talked about tonight starts to click into place. Because that gap is exactly what determines whether your next $1,000 becomes something or becomes nothing at all. Picture the moment clearly, the way it actually feels, not the way it looks written down. You finally have $1,000 that isn't already spoken for. No bill waiting for it. No emergency demanding it. Just $1,000. Sitting there, quietly, and a decision in front of you about what happens next. Most people, if we're honest, know exactly what they'd do with it. Pay down a little debt, maybe. Treat themselves to something they've been putting off. A nicer dinner, a small upgrade, something that feels like a reward for the stress of getting there in the first place. None of that is a moral failure. It's human. It's what almost all of us were trained to do with money that shows up unexpectedly. The wealthy do something different, and it's not because they have some secret formula unavailable to the rest of us. It's because somewhere along the way, someone taught them, or life taught them the hard way, to ask one question before spending that first meaningful sum. What can this money become if I don't touch it? Not what can this money buy me right now? What can it become? That single shift in framing, from consumption to construction, is more than any single investment strategy the real dividing line between people who stay stuck and people who eventually break free. Here's what that actually looks like in practice, stripped of any complicated jargon. The wealthy take that first meaningful sum and they put it to work immediately in something that has the potential to grow or generate income over time. It might be a small position in an index fund, quietly compounding in the background for decades. It might be seed capital for a small side business, something built on a skill they already have, tested cautiously, without quitting the day job. It might be education, not the kind that comes with a mountain of debt, but the specific, targeted kind that increases their earning power in a measurable way. What it's almost never spent on in that critical first moment is anything that loses value the second you own it. Not because those things don't matter. A dinner out matters. A little comfort matters. But timing matters more than most people realize, and the first dollars you're ever able to set aside carry more weight than any dollar that comes after them, because they have the most time left to grow. Let me explain why that matters so much, because this is where the real magic, if we can even call it that, actually lives. Money that's invested early doesn't just sit there accumulating slowly and steadily in a straight line. It compounds. It grows on top of its own growth, quietly, invisibly, for years, until one day the curve bends upward in a way that looks almost unbelievable to anyone who didn't understand the mechanism from the start. $1,000 invested at 45, left alone for 20 years in something reasonably positioned to grow, can become several times its original value by the time you're ready to slow down. That same $1,000 spent on a night out or a small upgrade becomes exactly zero the moment it's spent, not less than zero. Zero. Completely gone, with nothing left to show for it except a memory. And memories, however nice, don't pay your bills in retirement. I'm not telling you to never enjoy your money. That would be its own kind of trap, a joyless hoarding that mistakes deprivation for discipline. What I'm telling you is this: every dollar you're given a choice over is a small vote for the future you're building, or the future you're avoiding. And the wealthy, more than anything else, have simply cast more of those votes in the direction of ownership, patiently, consistently, starting with the very first meaningful sum they ever had control over. This is, in many ways, the entire philosophy hiding underneath everything we've talked about tonight. It's not about being born into money. It's not about some rare stroke of luck or a level of risk tolerance most people don't have. It's about a series of small, quiet decisions made consistently in the same direction, protected from the constant pull of a culture that profits enormously from your impulse to spend the moment money touches your hands. You are 40, 50, maybe older, and I know some of you are sitting there wondering if it's simply too late for any of this to matter. I want to be honest with you, the way I'd want someone to be honest with me. It's not too late. It might be later than you'd like. It might require more discipline now than it would have required 20 years ago. But the math of compound growth doesn't punish you for starting late. It simply rewards you less than it would have rewarded starting early. Less is still something. Less is still infinitely more than continuing to do nothing at all. And that thought, the idea that it's not too late, that the next decision still matters more than every decision that came before it. That's exactly where I want to take the rest of this conversation, because there's a call to action I want to make to you first, before we go any further together. If you're still here with me, this far into the video, I want to say something to you directly, because it matters to me more than you probably realize. You didn't have to stay. There are 1,000 other things pulling at your attention right now. A phone buzzing somewhere nearby, a dozen other videos promising something faster, something flashier, and you chose to keep listening anyway. That tells me something about you. It tells me you're not just looking for entertainment tonight. You're looking for something real, something that might actually change how the next 20 years of your life unfold. So if that's true, if this conversation is landing somewhere real for you, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and come back and sit with me again tomorrow, and the day after that. Not because I need the number to go up, though I won't pretend that doesn't matter to keeping this going, but because the people who actually change their financial lives aren't the ones who watch one video and feel inspired for an afternoon, then forget everything by the weekend. They're the ones who keep showing up, keep learning, keep refining the way they think about money, one conversation at a time, until it becomes part of who they are, quietly, without them even noticing the shift happening. And while I have you here, let me ask you something, and I mean it honestly. What's the one financial decision from your 20s or 30s that you'd go back and change if you could? Not to dwell on it, not to punish yourself with it. I'm asking because I think naming it out loud in the comments below does something powerful. It turns a private regret into a shared truth. And when you see how many other people are carrying the exact same one, you'll understand something important. You were never as alone in this as it felt. I read those comments, every one of them, and more often than you'd expect, they shape exactly what we talk about next on this channel. All right, let's get back to where we were, because there's something I haven't told you yet, and it might be the most important piece of this entire conversation. Everything we've talked about tonight, the math that no longer works, the invisible taxes quietly eating your paycheck, the asset versus liability decision that separates people forever, the incentives built into a system that was never designed to teach you this, what the wealthy actually do with their first meaningful dollars. All of it points toward one final truth, and it's the one most people resist the hardest because it requires something more uncomfortable than knowledge. It requires a decision about identity. Here it is, plainly. You cannot out-earn a mindset built for survival. You can get a raise, you can pick up a second job, you can work 60 hours a week for the next decade, and if the underlying belief driving your decisions is still, I need to spend what I have because tomorrow isn't guaranteed, you will remain exactly where you are, just with a bigger paycheck funding the exact same treadmill, running a little faster, going nowhere new. I've watched this happen to people who make more money than they ever dreamed of making, and they're still one bad month away from panic because the income changed, but the identity underneath it never did. And I've watched people with far more modest paychecks build quiet, genuine security because somewhere along the way, they stopped identifying as someone surviving and started identifying as someone building. That shift doesn't happen from watching one video. I want to be honest about that because I promised you at the start of this conversation that I wouldn't sell you a grand promise, and I meant it. It happens from 100 small decisions, repeated in the same direction, long after the motivation from tonight has faded and life has gone back to feeling ordinary again. But it does happen. I've seen it happen to people who started later than you might think is possible. People in their late 40s, their 50s, even their 60s, who decided one ordinary Tuesday, with nothing dramatic marking the occasion, that the story they'd been living wasn't the only story available to them anymore. What separated them from everyone who stayed exactly where they were wasn't intelligence. It wasn't luck, though luck helps everyone a little. It was the willingness to look honestly at the math we talked about tonight, to stop waiting for the old rules to come back, and to start making decisions built for the world that actually exists now, instead of the world they were promised as children by parents who meant well and simply didn't know any better. That's available to you too. Right now, tonight, this very week, starting with whatever decision is in front of you next. Not some distant, perfect decision you're waiting to feel ready for, but the very next one, however small it feels, however unremarkable it seems compared to the scale of everything we've discussed. Let's go back to where we started tonight. your father's house, 2.5 years of income once to own a piece of the American dream. 7 years now in most places. Sometimes 10 if you're standing in the wrong zip code at the wrong moment in history. I didn't bring you through all of this to make you angry at a number you can't control. I brought you through it because the anger, if you let it just sit there unused, doesn't build anything. It just burns quietly in the background of your life, while nothing around you actually changes. What builds something is understanding exactly what happened, exactly why it happened, and exactly what's still, even now, within your control. You know now that the game changed underneath the story you were told, quietly, while everyone kept teaching the old version anyway. You know the invisible taxes working against you every single month. Inflation, lifestyle creep, the slow erosion of what a dollar can actually buy. You know the one decision that separates people who feel stuck from people who feel free. Assets first, liabilities funded by assets, not by hope. You know why school never taught you any of this, and why that omission wasn't quite an accident, even if it wasn't exactly a conspiracy either. You know what the wealthy actually do with their first meaningful dollar, and why timing matters more than the amount ever will. None of that knowledge means anything, though, sitting quietly in your mind, admired but untouched. It only means something the next time $1,000 lands in your hands, and you pause, just for a moment, to ask the question that changes everything. What can this become if I don't touch it? I think about my own father sometimes, working those long shifts, coming home tired in a way that settled into his bones long before he was old, long before he should have been. He did everything right, by the rules he was handed, the only rules anyone ever gave him. And I used to be angry, for years, that those rules quietly stopped working right around the time it was my turn to use them, as if the door closed just as I reached it. I'm not angry anymore. Not because the unfairness disappeared. It didn't. And pretending otherwise would be its own kind of lie. A comfortable one that costs you nothing to believe and everything to act on. I stopped being angry because anger was costing me the one thing I actually had control over. What I did next, with what I had, starting exactly where I was standing, not where I wished I'd started instead. That's what I want for you. Walking away from this conversation tonight. Not motivation that fades by morning, gone the moment your alarm goes off tomorrow. Not some grand promise that everything's about to change overnight, because it won't. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something you'll regret buying. What I want for you is quieter than that, and steadier. I want you to see your next dollar differently than you saw your last one. I want you to look at the space between what you earn and what you spend, and understand that space is the only place freedom has ever actually grown, for anyone, in any generation, in any economy, good or bad. The middle class isn't disappearing because people like you stopped working hard. It's disappearing because the old map stopped matching the new territory, and too many good, hard-working people kept following directions that no longer led anywhere, trusting the map simply because it was the one they'd always trusted. You don't have to be one of them, not because you're smarter or luckier or somehow fundamentally different from everyone else still following that broken map, still waiting for it to start working again, but because now, tonight, you know something you didn't know an hour ago. And knowing changes what happens next, even if it doesn't happen all at once, even if nobody applauds you for it, even if the only person who ever notices the shift is you. quietly, a few years from now, looking back at exactly this moment. If this conversation gave you something real tonight, don't let it end here, alone, in the quiet of wherever you're watching this. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep having these conversations together, week after week, one honest topic at a time. And if you know someone, a brother, a friend, a coworker who's been quietly carrying the exact same weight you've been carrying, send this to 5 people who need to hear it as much as you needed to hear it tonight. Not because it will make you look generous, because it might be the exact sentence on the exact night that changes how someone else sees their next dollar too. Leave a comment below, honestly, about where you're starting from tonight, and tell me what you want me to cover next. Because this channel isn't really mine, it's ours. Built one conversation, one honest comment, one quiet decision at a time. I'll see you in the next one.